Okay, everyone. I think we're expecting a few more people, but I'm sure we'll get a bunch of people joining as we're talking and as we're doing our introductions. Thank you so much for joining this Counter Extremism Project event. For those of you who do or don't know, Counter Extremism Project is an international policy organization based in New York with offices in Berlin, Brussels, and London as well. I'm very proud and pleased to be part of the UK team. And I'm even more pleased today to be having a conversation that I've been really, really looking forward to, because I'm joined by Dr. Hugo Micheron, who, and I don't say this lightly or to just flatter you, but I think is probably one of the most interesting and insightful, not just academics, but I would say a thinker on jihadist terrorism. I think France seems to produce thinkers on this problem a lot more than some other countries. So I think you're among those. But he's also a lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris and Princeton University, where he's currently based. And he is the author of Le Jihadisme Français, which is, to be honest, again, not just trying to flatter you, but nothing short of a masterpiece. And I'm very, very much looking forward to its publication in English, which we will talk about towards the end of this conversation as well. But Dr. Hugo Micheron, thank you, bienvenue. And if there's anything I've missed in your introduction, please do tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you so much, Liam. I'm delighted, to be honest, to be exchanging with you today. Thank you very much for the kind and warm welcome. I'll try to be at my best today to just be able to match some of the expectations here, but no, it's my pleasure to be with you, with all of you today. I'm based in Princeton, as you said. I'm a lecturer and a research associate at the Near Eastern Studies department there. My work mainly focuses on European jihadism and basically the aftermath of the crisis in the Levant on European territories. I've been doing my PhD at École Normale Supérieure in Paris on the phenomenon of French foreign fighters, those who were joining ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Iraq. Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And through that work, I've been working mainly on three different field works. One is places and certain neighborhoods in France and Belgium where we noticed that there were some foreign fighters were from there and joining organizations on the ground in Syria. So, there is different clusters, different sort of ecosystems in Europe. And I've been, documenting this, and I realized that basically there were like 15 to 20 places in France that were the most concerned or the most affected by the jihadi phenomenon. There were like 5 to 6 in Belgium. And so I tried to understand what were the specificities of these specific neighborhoods. So I've conducted, field work interviews, participant observations in these neighborhoods. So that was the first field work of my PhD. The second one was sort of a mirror of the first one. It was to go in the accessible part of the Levant, so northern Lebanon and Iraq, of course, and Turkey as well, to try to understand the situation there and to document it from the other front, if I may say so. So mostly conducting interviews with Syrian refugees, with of course Kurdish fighters, with some as well Lebanese jihadists. To try to understand, the context in which these Europeans were actually getting involved in. And the third one was a sort of a field work in between those two, and it was the French prison system. So my point was to interview their returnees from Syria and Iraq, who were like fighting there or helping organizations on the ground, but also some French who were arrested before they could leave, or because they were planning an attempt or a plot, or plotting an attack in France. And overall, like also supporters, propagandists, and people were like broadly and generally speaking involved in the support of these groups, be them based in the Levant or in Europe. And so I've met like 80 of them in prisons. They were like, some of them were just like freshly returned from the Levant, where like some of them were fighting 3 weeks before in eastern Iraq, but others were like already trialed and sentenced since years. And so I have like a broad range of I will say a diversified sample of convicted and non-convicted jihadists. Some were, of course, younger than others. Some were very experienced. Some were like new to the activism, if I may say. And overall, I had, of course, male and female. Of course, I had way more, like an overwhelming share of them were male fighters, but I had also access to certain female who had a sort of a respectability in the organizations there. So I tried to have this approach, and I produced based on this a PhD, and that became a book, and that is now translated and will be published in English by Oxford University Press next January 2023.
Okay, so we definitely need to look out for that. So you mentioned, I mean, we build this as this discussion as the territories of European jihad, and you mentioned certain neighborhoods in France and Belgium, but not just France and Belgium. You mentioned Syria, and you mentioned prisons as well, and that's kind of the subtitle of your book, isn't it? Is it prisons, quartier, Syria? So that's the kind of overriding theme in your study and in your book, that we've maybe neglected the territorial dimension of this problem. And I think why I was so interested in it is because, like, I'm not an academic. I don't have the expertise or the experience to do the kind of study that you've conducted, but it was very clear that there was a geographical and territorial aspect to this problem that we were overlooking or ignoring, especially in the Anglosphere. And what your study has hopefully done is proven that, I think, conclusively. So could you just tell us a little bit about that territorial dimension?
Yes, actually, there is at least two aspects that I see regarding the territorial dimension of jihadism. And two are more like the bottom lines, or the starting point of my research than the ending point. So the first one is a response to a practical issue for me. As I was starting my fieldwork, I was like, how can I document the phenomenon? And we're talking about 2014 here, 2015, the beginning of my fieldwork. And I was like, how can I document the phenomenon? How can I have access to the actors on the subject, on the matter that is so important and so tricky, that is not easy to have access to, will be jihadists or people who are in Syria, in the most violent terrorist organization of the world. So, how, like, it's a basic question as a researcher. How do you produce knowledge by, documenting the phenomenon on the ground? And then I realized where the spaces where these people are, evolving. And what struck me in the first place is that, when I was on the ground in certain cities in France, like all across the French territory, there were people who were mentioning, a neighbor or a friend or an acquaintance from the neighborhood who either has joined an organization in Syria, or who were talking about jihad in Syria in a very in a praising manner, and or they were talking about preachers who were praising the Syrian jihad. And so that was the first starting point. I was like, okay, maybe I will start with these persons who are known in the neighborhoods and people talk about them, and even sometimes they publicly endorse these kind of positions. So maybe they will be keen to talk to a researcher. So that was the first aspect. Second, I was like, okay, where are they going to? And of course, they're talking about the Levant, which was the theater of the worst contemporary crisis, namely the Syrian civil war. And this is also a place to document. So I was looking at these places, and that was And then I realized, but almost by chance, that there was this third middle ground, which is the prison, where you have either like the people who went in Syria and came back and now are jailed, or the people who were like preaching and developing jihadi ideas somewhere and ended up in prison for that matter. And so this was a sort of a meeting point right at the crossroads of the first and the third territorial. And what I realized is that these three territories were actually a sort of a continuum, because you also have people in prisons who are there because they committed a crime, or they committed, that they robbed a bank, or you name it, and ended up in contact with these ideologues of the Syrian jihad, or Islamists who are keen to develop their theories and preach them in prisons. And therefore, these three territories that I've mentioned, you can put in all the way you want. You still have a continuum. You have people who are get sort of radicalized in prisons, and then when they went out, joined the ISIS in Syria. You have people who were first radicalized in their environments where they grew up, ended up in prison, then went to Syria, or went to Syria and ended up in prison. You've got people who were just heard about the Syrian jihad, went there, and ended up returning in their hometown, and then ended up in prison. So what you can take it the way you want. This triangle works pretty well. And for me, it was also a link between the individual approach that was at the time very dominant, and maybe we can talk about this later, and the sort of a more collective approach, which is the evolution of a movement, which, as we know, is also a part of the way jihadist organizations work. So that's the first aspect of the territorial dimension. It was a very practical sort of approach about how we can document a phenomenon and make sense of what it is. And so looking at these three territories was a way for me to sort of click the different wagons and the different places of expression of jihadism in Europe. The second aspect is also a starting point, but I will say that I'm quite surprised, because it seems that it's either still very much ignored, or it is still not clear for people that it is right there. So I'm going to try to put it, and I'm sorry for those who already heard me talking about this, because it's something that I bring a lot, because for me it's the starting point we should be discussing, which is, if you look at a map, a European map of people who joined ISIS, European citizens who joined ISIS between 2014 and 2018, what you will see is that there is 6,000 people, and all of them are coming from the EU 28. So I keep the UK in for that matter. They were still in the EU at the time, and an overwhelming majority, about 85 to 90% of them are actually coming from 7 countries. So France, the UK, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. And of course, if you had Spain, and you reach almost 90%. If you look inside of these different countries, so all of them, as you can tell, are Northern Western European countries, all right? So there is sort of a concentration of the phenomenon there. They, and you can notice that as well, respond to different culture, different history. Of course, they're all part of Europe, but they don't have the same social contract. In the UK, it's more like communalism. In France, it's laïcité. In Belgium, it's something else. In Germany, it's more like culturalism, with specificities, of course. And the Scandinavian countries have also their own sort of egalitarian approach. It's multiculturalism in the Netherlands. So, most of the time, the analysis that tend to frame the phenomenon inside national specificities tend to overlook that actually different countries with different culture, with different history. Some of them used to be former colonial empires, such as France and the UK in the Muslim world. Others were not, such as Scandinavian countries or even Germany. So, you have very different approach, different culture, different history. That's very important to have that in mind. They are all European industrial countries, but that's not to mention the Iraq War as well, which was often given as an explanatory factor. Exactly. So UK was involved in the war, even though there was a massive popular demonstrations against that. but France and Germany, for instance, were against, and actually France were quite vocal in 2003, even like addressing the possibility of doing a veto against, or vetoing the US in the UN. So, you know, quite strong and firm position on that matter. So we can like go for it for ages. Like we're talking about different situations with specificities, and also, of course, shared pattern. So one aspect. The second aspect is like if you dive and look at the national level in every one and each of these countries, you will find the same phenomenon that you will have at the European dimension, which is there is certain towns, certain cities where where 80 to 90% of the people who joined ISIS are originating from. So it's about 20 in France, it's about 12 to 15 in the UK, 12 to 15 in Germany, 5 to 6 Belgium, Netherlands, 4 to 5 in Sweden, Denmark, and so on and so forth. My point is, if you look at inside every single cities, you will find again the same phenomenon. Certain neighborhoods, certain very local environments are very much concerned, like we're very much affected, and people joined ISIS from there, but others are not. And to put it in a nutshell, what you will find is that there is no sort of the map of socioeconomic discrimination and marginalization is not overlapping neatly with the map of the people who joined ISIS in Syria. So my point is, we have to, I'm not saying that socioeconomic factors, political and cultural marginalization don't play a role. What I'm saying is, like, if you're trying to reduce and explain the European phenomenon using only these factors, you will not be able to explain it, because sometimes you got two cities that are twin cities, only separated by a few kilometers. And what you'll find is one is super affected with 80 people who join in ISIS, such as Trappes in France, and the other twin city with the same scenarios, same patterns, same socioeconomic factors. There is none. There is no one who joined in ISIS. And you have that in the UK, you have that in Belgium, where, for instance, Antwerp is, you know, very much affected by the phenomenon of foreign fighters, whereas the French-speaking part of Belgium, which is super disindustrialized, facing massive unemployment, is way less affected. So again, socioeconomic factors are not explaining all. You have to go way for it. And my point is, if you look at these places in details, the common pattern, the shared points, is that you will find a common history of militant and Islamist and activism, and a Salafi jihadi presence most of the time since the 1990s. So I'm not saying that this explains it all. I'm saying that's one factor that you need to combine with the others. And so that was my starting point. And that's like, okay, let's have a look at in these places. Let's understand what was the dynamic. And, you know, much to my surprise, locally, people were quite outspoken about this. They were quite like from people from all backgrounds. And I'm talking about religious leaders like imams, or like political leaders like mayors or elected, officials, but also like the locals, the inhabitants from the neighborhood. They were like, they were very aware of that history, saying, yeah, well, in the early 2000s, we were noticing people were coming here and there, and they were talking about the jihad in Iraq. And, I just came back from the UK, where I was conducting interviews there. And I was quite surprised that it was exactly the same things that I've heard in Belgium or in France. So I think we should pay attention to that, because it sort of give birth to a geography as well as to a history of the European jihadist phenomenon. And this is most of the time didn't even address, So that was my starting point. That's why I pay special attention. I will say that I will emphasize that territorial approach to the phenomenon.
I think what's interesting is, I think, like, since your work came out, and since even before it became a book, you kind of you realized that the key variable here was on the ground activism, either from like Salafi jihadist networks, or from veterans of previous jihads like Bosnia, Somalia, Afghanistan, Algeria. but what's also interesting is like quite a lot of research that's come out of France and Belgium, often conducted by people who probably have fierce disagreements on various different aspects, has actually all arrived at the same conclusion, that there are some neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly affected by this problem and some that are completely unaffected. And the actual key variable there is those on the ground activists. And what it does to me is it especially in the Anglosphere, is like this. I know you apologize for talking about something that you say a lot, and I'm going to do the same for anyone who listens to me speak. But a real bugbear in the Anglosphere, particularly for me, is this: how radicalization, which we should come to because that's a term in itself which has been really challenged in France, but this way of casting radicalization as like a kind of unwilling process, and fundamentally in like an online phenomenon, which is like child grooming, is something that affects adolescents, the vulnerable, and they're kind of bewitched by propaganda and recruited in their bedrooms by nefarious online recruiters. And your study shows that's not the case. Another huge study from the Institute Montaigne shows that's not the case. Gilles Capel's work shows that's not the case. Bernard Rougier's work shows that's not the case. So, I mean, the question, I guess, is like, what's the difference between the French understanding of this problem and our kind of understanding of radicalization, and what challenges are there to that term and concept in itself?
I don't know whether there is a French understanding, because there is still very much a debate about this in France. My point is, and with regard to your question, I think that there is what the phenomenon that you just described, people being alone, lonely on their internet, like on their computer, and being reached out by people. It's still like surely existing in existence, but it doesn't explain the phenomenon. And my point is that we're talking about a tiny minority of the phenomenon, when the bulk of it is actually way more easy to find in understanding the trends over the course of 20 years in specific areas. And that's my point, is just like, why aren't we looking at it? The debate in France is actually quite similar to that in other countries. Maybe it's more maybe developed in a sense that we have recent studies that are that were brought in the debate that provided new data and new elements. What I will say is that generally speaking, broadly speaking, in the debates, in the public debate, not in the academic debate, they tend to be like sort of two misconceptions. The first one is to say, well, it's mostly like a socioeconomic byproduct, like it's a marginalization thing. You can explain jihadism because in certain areas you've got the better off that took over the system, and then you've got the worse off that try to rebel, and the best way they find to do so when they are Muslims is to turn to jihad. Like to say, like the time is, the period is radical per se, and when you are in a context of radical ideas and radical struggles, where's the best dope you can find on the market? Where's the best drug? Well, you turn to jihadism, you turn to ISIS, and then you get a big name, and you have a way to revolt and a way to attack, and even like slogans to use, and actually quite a pretty dress, at least an honorable dress to wrap into, which is that of religion, that of Islam, and this is like sort of like something very powerful in terms of identity as well, to be able to frame your fight and struggle in these terms, in these religious and political claims.
This was the Olivier Roy kind of
yes,
debate.
I mean, it's I would say it's like a sort of a byproduct, at least of its works, and it was, I don't know whether it still is, but it was quite the dominant approach, because it's the most seductive, like out of the blue, if you start to explain hatred in the world, you will say, well, people are not bad per se. They might tend to rebel and find a cause to join, but per se they will not. They will not do so. And the other approach in France, which is more that of Gilles Capel, and it was my PhD supervisor at the time, is saying, guys, you forgot one thing, which is ideology. We're talking about guys who have references. They ground their words, they ground their claims in an ideology that have been developing in the world and fast accelerating since 30 years. and the beginning of it might be traced back to at least the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, but also like these actors are moderns in the sense that they are rooting their grievances in the language of Islam, even though they are like reproposing everything, even though they are like manipulating concepts, even though they are like, of course, politicizing and weaponizing so many things, so many concepts of the Islamic heritage and legacy. They're still like using it as a tool to recruit, you know, and this cannot be overlooked because some of them are actually very religious and some of them are very ideological in their way. They use religion, but still you will never make them say they're just rebel and normal rebels like the Red Brigade or whatever. So we need to understand these specificities. And I was sensitive to that when I started my PhD, because I was like, yeah, let's start from what they say they are and try to understand that and try to decipher, you know, what's the reality like. But it's not up to me to say who they are. You know, it's up to me to understand what they are saying and what it is saying of the world and the society we're living in. And but the thing is, this debate is most of the time it is becoming more and more a caricature of itself, where you've got it end up with people saying, you know, it's socioeconomic factors only, and people who end up saying, well, the problem is religion and religious factors and equal Islam. All right. And so my point is, it is a very like sort of a modern, like Western approach to things where we think that socioeconomic and religion are supposed to be opposed. You know, in which world are we living in? I mean, at what time cannot you bridge the two approach? I mean, you can have, you know, severe marginalization plus like massive religious indoctrinament. You know, it can work very well together. Actually, historically, whether we talk about Islamist movement or not, it was quite a push and pull factor all the time. So for me, it's simplistically speaking, it's super abnormal to be facing a situation like that. And for some reason that I'm unable to explain, in Western media and the Western debate, we're still much of the time, you know, very doubtful when it comes to like manipulating, you know, religious factors inside of it. And we're missing the point. So my point is to say, we need to look at what these actors are saying. We need to pay attention to the concept they are using. We need to understand the language they are speaking, be it in French or in Arabic or in English. We need to use all the tools that are, you know, useful and provided by social science and the humanities in a general sense, and try to use all of them to make sense of the phenomenon. So I will try to say that we should move like beyond that debate. We should try to be honest about also facts, because most of the time one of the approach or the other approach tend to overlook the very facts. And that's why I said that the territorial approach for me was just the beginning of the work. And what is surprising for me is like most people tend not to even address the territorial dimension because it's not fitting their conclusion, which is like, yeah, it's a socioeconomic phenomenon. And I think it's not right. And the problem is that we are losing time. And insofar, if you're looking at the development of jihadism in Europe, they were able to use time to develop themselves. I mean, we're talking about a phenomenon that in the 1990s was maybe gathering, you know, dozens or like a few hundred maximum of Europeans in their networks. And 20 years after that, in the middle of the Syrian crisis, with the peak of ISIS in 2015, we're talking about 6,000 Europeans directly involved in jihadi organizations. And
that's just travelers as well.
Not just travelers. It doesn't mean like the base of support elsewhere.
Is it interesting so as you said, like the socioeconomic marginalization doesn't explain it, but then also you've got kind of ideologues on the right and the far right as well who would like to characterize this as like a Muslim problem, and this only, you know, affects Muslim areas and things like that. But actually, there are plenty of cities and towns with high Muslim populations which are unaffected by this problem. Marseille being an example. I can think of a few examples in the UK as well. So it's not just the socioeconomic marginalization argument that falls down. It's like, again, it comes back to the key variable being that on the ground activism. It's not just internet access, it's not just socioeconomics, and it's not just oh, this is something that, like, you know, we need to like securitize Muslim populations because of this problem. So all those polarities of explanations kind of fall down.
Yes, I mean, I want to say something about the sort of the polarization of the debate about it. So you've got on the one hand, and that's the most the best understood, I'll say, trap in the public debate, is that of the far right. So basically they are saying, look, the problem is jihadism. Jihadism is extreme Islamists are Muslims, so the problem is with Muslims, you know, like a sort of a very like dramatic reduction of an unnuanced approach to the issue that basically is very problematic, because it ends up saying exactly what the jihadists want us to say, which is that they are the true representative of Islam. And what they are actually doing is like the fundamental development of this religion. And we are giving them the keys of the representation of the true Islam. And that is something that we grant them. And they were willing for us to say that for the past, you know, since the very beginning, actually, since Afghanistan and even before that. So that's this sort of shortcut is super problematic, because it ends up like reinforcing the jihadi narrative, and we intend to turn a blind eye on the situation where actually Muslims are targeted, not only physically by jihadists, but also ideologically and religiously by their propaganda, by these persons saying to other Muslims, if you're not following us, you're wrong. You're wrong Muslims, you're on the wrong path, you're becoming an atheist, you're compromising your religion. And so by saying that, the far right narrative is sort of embracing the jihadi narrative, and it's like not only put like sort of squeezing the entire society in the middle, it's also squeezing, you know, Muslims that never asked themselves this kind of question in the middle, and that's very problematic for the future. Mm-hmm. There is another trap, and this is mostly on the far left that you will find it, and it's very problematic too. And for some reason, it tends to be less understood, and I think it's as big as the first one. I mean, at least it's a like a dialectic, like it's a response to the other one, which is tend to say basically, oh, there is hatred in the society, and we are facing polarization, so we should not put the blame on Muslims. So it's not, I'll say, with like good intentions, but it turns out that by wanting to do so, it tends to overlook the very existence of Islamism, and tend to overlook the reality, which is that jihadists are putting pressure on the others, and they are using different tools. They are using other kind of movements. They are, of course, even though they can be rival, they are, of course, using certain Salafi narratives to start to put on the blame, and Salafi techniques and other Islamist organizations to either recruit or, you know, put pressure on. And so by not saying that, by turning a blind eye on this, it tends actually to reinforce this very same problem, which is that if you don't want to address the problem, then it get bigger, you know? And so the society now, the general public debate is sort of encroach between these two pressure, which is one saying, look, the problem is with Muslims, so we should just like Donald Trump, implement a Muslim ban, whatever. And the other saying, you know, you guys are all racist because there is no problem and you're creating one. And these two situations are very problematic because it's out of the bound of reality. So what I think we should do is first to develop and produce more diagnostic, and that is lacking. You know, I mean, if you look at problems of massive importance now in the world for the stability of democracy or of the world, let's take maybe the prime one, which will be global warming. You will have every year some scientific reports, you know, by like famous scientific that are producing. And where are the diagnostics when it comes to the development of jihadism? You know, across my study, I've ended up figuring out that there is not even a complete and comprehensive history of the jihadi phenomenon in Europe. I mean, we're talking about a phenomenon that is 30 years old. We're talking about a phenomenon that has caused the death of thousands of people, injured even more so, and that creating massive political trouble in Europe. And there is not even a single comprehensive, academically made academically produced history of the phenomenon in Europe. You get here and there a piece of it, but you don't have the full stuff. So we need more. And I will end up responding to your question by this. In the UK context, for instance, what is very important to understand is like they were not specifically hidden. If you look at what happened in London in the 1990s, at the time where there was a situation in London where London was hosting, dozens and dozens of jihadi propagandists who were fighters in Afghanistan or who were involved, at least, in jihadi networks in Peshawar in Pakistan, such as Abu Qatada, for instance, or Abu Hamza al-Misri, or even other like propagandists like Omar Bakri Mohammed, who was the former leader of the Hizb al-Tahrir and then ended up funding al-Muhajirun, the organizations. They were, like publicly saying and putting their agenda on the public sphere. Like they were like guys like Omar Bakri Mohammed, he was adamant in saying that one day he wants the black flag to float over 10 Downing Street. He never hid himself. Actually, he was seeking publicity in the debate. And for some reasons, for some people, like even like alert and respected journalists, they were perceived as jokers. And on the other hand, you have people who were like saying like, look, this is what Islam is nowadays, where it was the trap, it was already set there. And we're still in the middle of it. And my point is, if you look at these organizations that were tiny at the time, if you like just took them seriously, if you just listen to what they're saying and look at their activities, they were funding, schools, they were funding legal organizations like NGOs, they were developing, seminars, and they were like, of course, taking the hand over certain mosques in certain areas. So they were active on the ground. They were doing basic militancy. They were developing their networks and contacts throughout Europe in the very same countries that we just mentioned, the 7 countries that will be the most affected by ISIS foreign fighters phenomenon 20 years after that. Then you start to like connect the different dots between what's happening now, what was happening there. And therefore you need to look at what's happening within the Islamic circles and this kind of militancy that is not only just fueling jihadism, but that is also actually developing a narrative that goes against every basic values of European democracies. And this is, of course, tricky because it gets more political, but we have the tools to address these kind of things in a democracy. I mean, if you look at what's happening again on the far right, we have no problem in, calling, a bird a bird. Like we have no problem calling, white supremacism as a massive problem and a threat for, general democracies and liberal democracies in Europe. Why can't we understand that when the Hizb al-Tahrir in the 1990s was spreading their ideas, it was actually a sort of an Islamist supremacism, at least, I mean, of course, there is specificities once again, but it tends to converge with the same denunciation of liberal basic democratic values. I mean, stuff that are, supposed to be considered as a problem, at least as an issue that has to be developed and debated and documented in. And for some reason, we still have some reluctancy. And therefore, we over-responsibilized Muslims, the Muslim communities. We over-responsibilize them in producing new leaders that will be able to denounce that. But we are sort of refraining ourselves to actually document a phenomenon that belongs to everyone, that belongs to the public debate. So, I mean, that's how I'll frame it. It was a very long response. But the downside, I will say, of this debate that is very polarizing, but not putting us together in considering an issue that should bring us together.
No, absolutely. I think the taking this out of its historical context when we talk about ISIS foreign fighter flows is just so neglectful to not take into account. I mean, you talked. It's not just historical context. You talked about how the Islamist movements that are non-jihadist are part of this if not part of the problem, they're not part of the terror problem, they're part of the picture. And even if we don't want to vilify and condemn, we don't need to go down that road first. We at least need to acknowledge that this is part of the picture. The exiles from the Middle East in the 60s and 70s from Muslim Brotherhood linked parties who settled in Northwest Europe, many of the countries you listed, who set up activist charities, NGOs, and then the veterans of jihad from the early 90s, late 80s. This stuff matters, but we kind of acted like this is a flash in the pan at the time. And I just want to come to prisons, because that was obviously a massive part of your study, but I also want to get somewhere first before we do that, if we've got time. And I've just read in the chat, some people have asked about asking questions. Sorry, I should have said we will take some questions towards the end. Hugo, we might go a few minutes over. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I have no problem. I mean,
okay.
You're the British. You're the one supposed to be very on time. So I'm French. I'm always.
That's not me. That's not me. We can stop for a little cafe in the middle if you want. But no. But before we get to the prisons, yeah. So if you do have questions and you're in the audience, just put them in the chat, and we'll come to as many as we can. So prisons, DRAD, and stuff like that. Let's talk about that in a minute. But we've talked a little bit about the foreign fighter flows 2014, 15, 16, they were at their apex. Let's play devil's advocate here. Why the hell are we talking about this now? Why is it still important for us to talk about this now? Why are we not two guys sitting here trying to breathe life into something which is no longer a threat because it's, because we're grifters or whatever? Why are we talking about this? Why shouldn't we be looking at the next threat? Why is it important to actually do this recent historical work? Why is this conversation happening?
Short answer, because it's not over, period. I mean, what I try to understand is, what was the origin of ISIS? And the short answer is well, it could be traced back to the 1990s. That's what I try to explain here to you guys. And I'm not the only one, of course, working on this or being able to talk about that. But my point is, if you're looking at the phenomenon in an historical context, what you will see is the seeds were planted in Afghanistan in the 1980s, even before that, ideologically speaking, but the organization and practical seeds were planted in Afghanistan, then sort of moved to London and Brussels and Copenhagen in the 1990s through different vectors, but the prime one was veterans from Afghanistan or former Islamists involved in Egypt or in Algeria or in Bosnia, and that started preaching in their surrounding, okay, and then it developed sort of the beginning of it triggered the Europeanization of the phenomenon, in the sense that European born and bred were started to develop their own ideas about jihad and jihadism, and ended up in Iraq in the mid-2000s, and ended up in Afghanistan for the Brits or for the German in the end of the 2000s, and all of them also developed in their entourage, in their surroundings, certain preaching that gave birth to a new phenomenon that will be the massive movements that will fuel ISIS, the foreign fighters movement in the late 2010s, in the mid of the 2000s, in the last decade. Now, ISIS, in the form of a so-called caliphate, in the form of an organization in Syria and Iraq that hold a territory, is destroyed. It's still there. There is still some networks. We could have seen that very recently with the attack against the prison in northeastern Syria, in the prison controlled by the Kurds. So it's still there. They're still active. They're still very active online. But the momentum is not with them, at least for the moment. And what I'm trying to say is that if you're looking again in the past 3 decades, there were peak points, the one that I've just mentioned, and there were weak points, sort of period of weakness, where they were unable to act right after 9/11, when the bases were destroyed in Afghanistan, right at the end of the 2000s, early 2010s, when the jihadism in Iraq was destroyed, when bin Laden was killed, when Awlaki was killed. There was a period of crisis, and right after that we got ISIS. So now we're again sort of in a low tide mode. That is something that I developed for a publication that will be released in France next week. And in these low tide modes, we tend to consider that, jihadism or global jihadism is done. Like we're done with it. Or if it's not definitive, then at least it's just it's just like sort of backpedaling, and we're okay with that. The security threat is declining, so we're on top of that. We can move and start discussing to other subjects of importance because we don't have to focus on this anymore. My point is that it's actually the opposite that we should be doing. We should be focusing on these periods, the low tide mode, the period of weakness of jihadi movements, to actually try to understand what they are doing, what they're saying, because this is going to explain the next wave, if there is one, when they will come back. The reconfiguration is happening now. It's not happening when they are at their peak and actually developing attacks all across the world because they have the capabilities to do so. When they're in low tide mode, when they are arrested in French, German, British prisons, or when they are like even in Kurdish prisons in Syria, we are not stopping the time. They own the time. They can discuss, they can exchange ideas, they can actually, sort of make a debriefing of what happened for them in Syria and Iraq, or what happened for them in Afghanistan, and why they failed. And this is exactly what they are doing. When I was in French prison, I was quite impressed by the intellectual level of certain of them, very well articulated, and they were thinking quite fast about, what was the reasons why ISIS, fell, and what was the mistakes that the ISIS leadership did, and how they could overcome that, and how they should, take the time to actually reconfigure and recruit and come back stronger. So of course, for so many around here, it could be just like a fantasy, like something that doesn't sound right, like something that is just here to afraid people. But if you look at what happened the past 3 decades, this is exactly what happened in this period of reconfiguration. So at least we should not take the chance of always relying on jihadists for them to make the mistakes that will bring them to fall, just like, beheading an American journalist in the middle of the desert in 2014, that will bring actually Barack Obama to start, being interested again in Iraq and actually decide to develop drone strikes there and actually consolidate the international coalition against ISIS, or, try to, in a different way, to develop the attacks in France in 2015 that sort of decided European Union to definitely, fight against ISIS there. Like there is, if you look at what's happening with the Taliban, they're saying, well, we're not going to, conduct attack against Europe, against the West, we're doing our own thing. And look at them, they have the land now, they have the territory. So I think that is very important to understand that there is 2 different modes. One mode is the jihadi when they are at their peak, they are visible, they commit attacks, they are recruiting people to hold the territory and to impose what they consider the Sharia law on these territories. And this is like obvious. This is what everyone has in mind when we're talking about jihadism. But there is a different mode, and that's the one we're conceptually overlooking, which is when these so-called organizations are destroyed or are actually facing troubles. And they're like, it's not like they have their own ideologues. Now they have European ideologues, and that is very important to understand the change. I recall one of the the interviewee that I've met, one of the guy was quite brilliant. He told me, maybe the next generation of jihadists will be Europeans. Like he said, maybe the next Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi will be French or British or German. Maybe the next El-Adnani will be Belgium. This is very important. It says that they have a sort of a generational understanding of their evolution. They understand that they're part of it. They are giving maybe their life to that, but maybe they also are giving birth to a new generation. And for that matter, the involvement of women inside ISIS, which is really like maybe the prime revolution that ISIS brought to the global jihadism movement. The involvement of women now changed the deal in the sense that they will give birth to children like lion cub that they will be able to educate within this ideology ideological movements. And it means that there is a generation that might be bred as jihadists from the very beginning. And this was not the case. So far, it was like a sort of an elite that was involved in Al-Qaeda, selectively recruited, and just like recommending other people around them that were sure. And ISIS just like exploded the border of this approach to jihadism and make it more like a mass movement. So it's not a mass movement in Europe, but it's now starting to think itself as such. And that's why we should absolutely look at the inner reconfiguration within jihadi circles and more broadly Islamist movement in Europe since the fall of ISIS, since 2018, 2019. And I think we tend to overlook that because now we're mostly concerned about far right. And I'm not saying it's not important, it's super important, but we should not put all the forces on that front. We should also like still have people looking up and trying to understand what's happening there.
It's a difficult case to make, isn't it? Like, I mean, you mentioned the far right, if I can be blunt, like obviously it's a problem, but I think there's a lot of alarmism about it as well. And I think like I kind of am a bit allergic to alarmism. So like I kind of even cringe a little bit even when I talk about jihadism. I make the same case as you, I don't think this is finished yet. I think we need to be paying attention, but also I want to make it clear I'm not being an alarmist. I don't want to be an alarmist. I'm not arguing for like some crazy new sweeping pieces of legislation in response to this. I think the other thing is, sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is exactly my point. What I'm saying is like, if we don't want to be an alarmist, then we should like be like just like constant. Because the thing is, because we tend to overlook the evolution of jihadism between two attacks, then we wake up late all the time. And then the alarm is ticking. And then, when it's just like the bell is on, we are like, oh, look at this attack. And then we tend to rediscover the reality of jihadism every attack. And what I'm saying is that we give them this advance that they don't have like in the first place. But because we are lagging behind, because we are not interested in what they're saying, we tend to rediscover this after 3-4 years, instead of at the very moment they're actually developing their thoughts. And this is not a functional way of addressing an issue. And that's my only point. I'm not saying that we should change the legislation, for instance. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that with constant law, we can actually tackle that issue, but it means also we need to think it. And that's a security problem, but the security problem is maybe the best covered right now. But the political and intellectual implication of jihadism in Europe is not well addressed for me, as far as I'm concerned, at least. This is my opinion.
No, I agree. I think like you said, we get a foreign fighter flow, we get an attack, and that's when the overreaction and that's when the alarmism comes. Exactly. So just, I think last question from me, and then I'll take some that have been very kindly dropped in the chat. So coming to prisons, but specifically one issue in prisons, I think, because obviously you mentioned you interviewed dozens of imprisoned jihadis in France as well. There's an awful lot of people who are, even if they weren't put into prison under terrorism legislation in French prisons, who are considered radicalized or extremist. The same in the UK, the same in Germany, probably more than at any other point in our kind of collective histories. We don't have the same sentencing as a country like the US, so many of these people are going to get out relatively soon. I think there's quite like a few dozen are on their way out before the end of the year in France. And I think in the UK, with a few incidents that have happened in prison or either with people recently released from prison, the word deradicalisation has been very high on the agenda. Where do you stand on that debate? Take that as to mean whatever you want, because it's a very broad question.
Well, I think that no, you know what? In France, the term radicalization is not even used nowadays. I mean, it has been replaced by what they call désengagement or disinvolvement, if you want, which is basically they try to block the violent expression
rather than trying to change somebody's belief system. Yeah, I think that they switched to similar language in the UK as well, but I think that word derad still kind of hangs over a lot of this debate.
So basically what they did is like they recognized that changing the way someone thinks is not correct, and it's not actually efficient, and it's not working, but they replace it by something that I find quite disheartening, in the sense that they consider that if someone is not involved or not willing to be involved in a violent movement, it's okay. And the problem with that, in the first place, is, as I just said, jihadi movement, when they feel they are in a period of weakness, they are not willing to conduct attacks. They are pragmatists in the sense that if the iron fists with what they consider the enemy, the liberal European democracies and their societies, is not in their favor, or they think they are like too weak to act, they will tend not to act too fast. You know, of course, you've got differences. You've got people who will use their autonomy to act, to commit like knife stabbing attacks, stuff like that. But I'm talking about the members affiliated with an organization. They will be pragmatic. They will say, if we cannot change the balance of power between us and the enemy, then we should not act violently and not act visibly. And so in the time when they are like reconfiguring in period of weakness, when they are behind the bars, when they feel like exposed, jihadists will not tend to commit and engage in violent activities. So if that's one of the biggest criteria you've got inside the prison system to monitor them and to to grade them, I don't know what will be the right word, then you will tend to tick the box non-violent for everyone. And I'm not talking about the guy who obviously are manipulative, that are actually attempting to manipulate the administration. I'm talking about guys who are genuinely jihadists but not ready to commit a crime right now because it's not the right moment for them. And this is, so first is embracing the sort of period of weakness thing. The second stuff, the problem that I have is if you're not looking at the roots of the phenomenon, then don't expect a different outcome. And these guys are justifying themselves. They are justifying their actions based on a worldview that is coined in religious terms. And that is referring to several concepts that have been developed within Islam, different Islamist movements for years now. And if we are not looking at these channels, ideological channels that have been fueling a narrative that is now used by jihadists, then why will we expect a different outcome? And my point is, if you look at the past 3 decades, once again, massive changes happen within European Islam. It has been, strike, and it has been the object of an internal revolution that has been the spread of Salafi concepts within European Islam. And this has to be addressed as well. I'll take a concrete example for you guys to have in mind. It was at the very beginning of my interest in this, before I start my PhD. I was first on the ground experience in 2008. And I remember I was in the neighborhood and I was talking to an inhabitant of this neighborhood, an impoverished area in the Paris region. And one of the guys, one of the interviewee was saying, there is Salafi around and we know them in the neighborhood, but they are bad Muslims. And the guy counted them as bad Muslims, and he was considering himself as a Muslim, say, they are extremists, basically. Same place 10 years after that, 2018, when I'm finishing my PhD or my fieldwork there, I go back to the same neighborhood and Salafis were still there. Arguably, they were even a greater number in the neighborhood, but that's debatable. But one of the guys, very similar to the one that I've interviewed 10 years before that, said, they are there. I'm not. He was also considering himself a Muslim, but they are right. They are the good Muslims. I am the bad one. What I mean by that is that the norms sort of changed over decades regarding what is acceptable, what's the norm in Islam. And in the first place, in the late 2000s, at least in this area, supposedly Salafism was perceived as an extreme expression of Islam. 10 years after that, it was supposed to be the norm, and the guys who were not abiding by this were like, okay, I know I'm on the wrong side of it, but I stay as I am, And this is very important, because if you don't address this change, then you don't get why an idea so radical as the Salafi Jihadi project could gain in momentum in certain communities and not in others. And this has to be addressed by looking at what has been the drivers for the development of Salafism and more broadly, radical and extremist ideas within the Muslim community. Of course, the general context, the geopolitics of the Middle East explain part of it. Of course, the marginalization of certain area explain part of it. But we are also talking, and that's the unaddressed part, the one that is the least addressed, of activists on the ground, providing on a daily basis narratives, providing a way to frame your ideas. And that in the UK, in the British context, has been the work of the Hizb ut-Tahrir that have been so efficient. It is not a Salafi jihadi narrative at all, but it has provided, and I've discussed that with former Hizb ut-Tahrir members in the UK. Recently, they were explaining how, you sort of reshuffle, you rebrand everything in your brain and try to see it through a different lens, and you address reality differently, and you're sort of what they call radical change. Even the Hizb ut-Tahrir were talking about this as radical change in your life, in the way you frame things and in your worldview. And this was happening with school kids, was happening in high school for decades, So we need to address that as well. And I was saying that we should put the blame on this. We should address that because Salafi jihadi by themselves, they are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. And if they are not recruiting, if they are not able to develop, they will, of course, disappear. Because we're talking about, like, if we keep to the same figures, 6,000 European jihadists directly involved in ISIS over a population of 450 million citizens in Europe. So, putting it in this, like, it's overwhelming that they are like a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. So, but if we don't look at how they were able to recruit within Tahriri circles or Salafi circles or Brotherhood circles, then we're missing a point. And honestly, we should be like addressing that as well as all the different aspects.
I think that touches on like one of my reservations about the framing of both radicalization and de-radicalization is this kind of sudden spiritual break with like liberal democratic norms rather than actually the product of this kind of entirely different cultural moral universe which has been developed over the course of like 30 or 40 years, like you mentioned, in Western Europe. So it's not like to the Salafi jihadists in prison who maybe like different states are trying to de-radicalize, like it's the outside world which is radical. Like now they're on the straight and narrow, like they're pious, they're good citizens, well, not citizens of the nation state, but they're kind of responsible human beings. But it's this kind of world of sin outside of it which is the real radical world. Anyway, I want to come to one of the questions in the chat, which actually is really good because I wanted to get to this as well. I know we're going over. Is about the kind of specifics of the French social contract and the specifically you mentioned the model of laicity, because I think especially in the wake of Samuel Paty's murder in that was 2020, wasn't it? Late 2020. There was obviously a massive international reaction, particularly from the United States, where you are now, and from the US media, which was very hostile to France. And you kind of waded into that debate as well. So could you talk a little bit about the misconceptions there, about that response, but also the specifics of the French model and social contract to this problem? Because I think that's, now that France has been targeted so much, I think that's a common thing that you hear said is like, this is the specifics of the way France is doing this.
All right, so first I'll answer about the French case specifically, then the reaction and the US coverage of it, which could be actually broadened to an Anglo-Saxon coverage. So the French case, as I've mentioned, first, France was the first exporter, if I may say, of jihadi foreign fighters in Syria, because we had 2,000 Frenchmen and women who were involved in ISIS. So it makes the French the biggest provider of jihadists in Syria.
But not per capita, right? Just
exactly.
In total.
So in volume, like in total, in absolute terms, it's like twice the number of Brits. But if you're looking on a per capita basis, then you'll have Sweden, Denmark, and Belgium, like that are way above France. So this is important because once again, and I already framed the pattern, like we're talking about very different countries that are actually affected and arguably in a position, in a situation that is as difficult as France. Why Denmark produced so much jihadi per capita? Again, look at history, look at what happened. You will understand certain things that are completely unrelated to the French case, completely unrelated to the French laïcité, and so on and so forth. Having said that, in France, the specifics of France, which is this social contract based on laïcité, is per se and is perceived by jihadists as the absolute opposite of their project. And I want for fact that I've discussed this a lot with prisoners and returnees who were saying basically, look, okay, I'm French, but I really think that France is now the lighthouse of the Western world, in terms of all the concept that France have provided to the world, free speech, separation of the church and the states, of course, laïcité, one of them. And they were like, one of them even said, like, France is a factory of the Western world. It produces ideas that travel to the world. And he was like, he told me, like, I'm maybe French saying so, but I think like there is an exception in the French case, in the sense that you tend to perceive France as a universal sort of model that need to be developed to the world, and this is what we're targeting, because we think ourselves as having a universal model that is quite opposed to yours. So on this, the French case being targeted for what it is and for being like sort of an influential voice in the Western world is quite well made, I will say. And this is not only French jihadists were saying that, because it could be traced back to Algerian Islamists in the 70s that were actually framing the same way, using the same attacks against French model. And of course, this is adaptive, because if you look at what was the situation in the 2000s, then it was the UK that was targeted for exactly what it is for, because the UK was a multiculturalist society that was open to every wind, and therefore was not, was praising a different model as communitarism that was mostly brought by these activists. Third point, and this is very important to me, is the US coverage of this.
Just before you get to that, sorry. I mean, just like, this is not even a question, this is just my thought in response to your discussion there. Like the specifics, in like you said, in one way, it's not just about the French social contract because of all the different countries that are affected and with vastly different circumstances, but also like it does come back to the role of the kind of non-violent Islamist groups here, because in many ways, laicity, that system doesn't give them the room to breathe in the way that a multicultural system does. So it's not just the jihadists that are like vocally opposed to laicity, it's the non-violent, the kind of Muslim Brotherhood offspring groups, the more activist Salafi groups are just,
yes,
laicity doesn't give them the room to breathe, whereas actually they could, if you've got a bit of a longer term vision, you could, use multicultural systems more to your advantage.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's very important, and I was actually that's a point that I wanted to bring as well, which is to put it differently, the French laïcité system is sort of exposing them more than they are in Belgium or even in the UK. And I'll take an example for that. One of them told me, like, in France, we're like constantly, whatever we try to do will be exposed, whereas in Belgium and in the UK, it will be more difficult for the authorities to actually tackle our activities here. So there is this sense of the laïcité also as a sort of a legal framework that is less tolerant in terms of Islamist activities, and so they cannot exploit the same way. If you look back at what was happening in London in the 1990s, what's appalling is that the activists, the very activists that we've mentioned, Omar Bakri Mohammed or Abu Hamza or Abu Qatada, they were using, free speech. They were using tolerance to actually spread hatred and intolerance. And that is something that is very tricky to understand, because how do you respond to a movement that is using, the very values of the system, such as freedom of speech, free belief, as a way to actually contravene the meaning of it. Like they were using tolerance, the tolerance within the UK context, to actually fuel intolerance and develop intolerant ideas within religious circles. So how you tackle that? It's very tricky, and that's something that we saw everywhere in Europe. They were funding legal activities like legal organizations, schools, private schools, to actually spread some ideas that were very opposite to the basic norms and values and standard values in European democracies. So we need to have that in mind as well, that it's very difficult. And I'll say that to that extent, the French laicite system is more protective of basic, norms, or at least it has a sort of way to unveil more rapidly certain abuses. But having said so, and I'm not saying that it's a perfect system, I'm saying that sometimes it's like French laicite system is terrible in the sense that it tends to not to see the role of religion, it tends to not to understand the weight of religious ideas and the importance of it for certain part of the population. So I'm not praising a system here. I'm trying just to say on a very basic, practical approach when it comes to Islamist activism, it also like sort of offers some protections.
It's just about the relationship between the two. Like I wouldn't swap the system in the UK for the system in France and vice versa. Yeah,
exactly, and it won't work actually. And when it comes to Samuel Paty, which was beheaded, so he was a school teacher who addressed in one of his classes, and he was obliged to. He addressed the question of free speech and the cartoons affair. And he showed one in class to debate about it, and he ended up being beheaded at the exit of his high school in close to the region of Paris. And this was, of course, like a shock, massive shock for French population. School teacher, like, is a representative of this sort of common French identity since the Third Republic, so since the late 19th century. So this was a big shock. It came in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks trial that was happening at the moment. So massive shock. And what I discovered is that some of the coverage by the best newspaper in the US, or supposedly the best, which are, to name but a few, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but also Fox. I mean, we're talking about like high quality magazines here and newspaper. I was quite appalled to read the news on the very day it happens. And, in the word jihadism was not used only once. The word Islamism happened only once in the New York Times article at the very end of it, in a quote by someone by someone saying, "I am afraid that the people who denounce Islamism will actually use that as a pretext to fight back against Muslims." So as a threat, that's something that was turned as a threat against Muslims. So a professor that is beheaded, in the middle of the street in France was actually coined as almost something that was problematic because of the reactions of French against Muslims, which is not even the point here. The point was actually what happened. It was not even qualified as a jihadi attack, even though the guy was related to jihadists in Mali and received direct orders. I mean, not direct orders, he had direct conversations with people in Syria, in northern Syria, that were inside jihadi ranks. So you see that the situation here is problematic. The coverage in itself is sort of, not fact-based. It put the facts on the side, and in the Washington Post coverage, and this for me struck me a lot, for a newspaper whose slogan is "Democracies die in darkness." Well, the sort of the middle ground, the middle voice that was put forward in the article was that of the Chechen dictator Kadyrov, that was presenting his idea, saying, well, it's not right to draw some cartoons, but it's not right to kill, basically. And they say, oh, look, Kadyrov said that. And the fact that the Washington Post was using Kadyrov as a sort of an example of a moderate voice in Europe, when he knows that the guy is, is authoritarian. I mean, there is nothing to say about it. He's even like endorsing that very much so. It's quite it was quite appalling and quite concerning, to be honest. And so I just like wrote an op-ed saying, look, the debate in the US and in Europe, as a consequence of that, is sort of struck in between two, between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, you have people who don't even recognize jihadism for what it is, the one that I've described, and don't understand that it's actually a phenomenon in Europe that is very problematic. And on the other hand, you've got all the far rights, and in the US, it was like mostly the Trumpist coverage that was basically saying, look what we were saying, we were right on the Muslim ban. And we have as a society the duty to sort of push this sort of coverage back and try to reproduce a common understanding of just like the facts, and then we can debate about all of this, but just to be agree on basic stuff.
Well, I think you in the op-ed that you mentioned, you talked about an increasingly distant relationship in the US and North America and as a whole with freedom of expression, which I think, like, this is just my opinion, but like the New York Times and Washington Post increasingly kind of seem under the sway of a more authoritarian mindset and kind of abandoned liberal kind of ideals to some extent in favor of this very like identity-based progressive ideology, which is just not, it's just less and less less and less concerned with the truth, if I can say so.
I don't know for like all the matters, but on this very specific coverage, it was quite concerning. And I think overall, not only for this newspaper, but overall in the US, there is a sort of a bigger distance with the European debates and the European reality. I mean, when we're talking about the pivotal change that the US are strategically doing, looking more east, looking more about the struggle against China, then we've of course perceived the withdrawal from Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq as part of it. But what we don't understand is like this is also happening in Europe. I mean, there is like a sort of a bigger distance with European issues and on jihadism for most of the policymakers and thinkers in the US. It's something that is done. It's something from the past. It's not their business, and they don't understand that the expression of the phenomenon in Europe is not only about racism. They tend to like sort of put like American Googles to just read the European situation through their lens, and it's not effective. It's not reality. So that is, of course, sort of something that we need to explain to them. Yeah, but I mean, don't know whether that will work actually.
No, I don't think so. But I mean, it doesn't bode well for. I mean, if we do see more attacks, I just think that inability to understand the European response is going to be something that comes up again. Just one last question from the audience. I think, like, I'm just reading some of them, but I think we've covered quite a lot in the course of our conversation. I think somebody's talked about, I think that's Fires has talked about how you're right to talk about Anjem Choudary, like the media kind of took people like him as jokers and a bit of a novelty rather than as serious as they turned out to be. But there's also a question about foreign fighters. So I guess this comes back to our discussion about jihadism between the attacks, the low and the high tide. Are we going to see foreign fighter travel in the future potentially? And if we don't see that, how does jihadism manifest itself within Europe?
Well, that's the one.
I know predicting the future is a very perilous endeavor, but
yes,
if we can.
Sometimes, I mean, before predicting the future, we should sometimes just look at what's happening at the moment, and that's maybe the most difficult. Well, I think so. It's impossible to predict anything, but again, looking at the past and trying to draw some lessons from that, what we'll see is that there is some. They're working using momentum. What I mean by that is that jihadists, they don't have much of an ability to shoot the first blow. I mean, most of the time they are like targeting crisis, and they are like sort of making their nests inside this crisis, such as the Syrian crisis, the Iraqi crisis, and from that they take advantage of it. They try to make the most of it, and they try to attract foreign fighters from that. Whether this will be the case in the coming decades in Syria and in Iraq, once again, it's a probability, because it's still very unstable. The situation is not settled there, be it politically or militarily, and of course economically. Be it in Africa, like in the sub-Saharan area, where we see that the French operations there is failure, and that there is now a greater part of even West Africa that is now affected by jihadi dynamics. I don't know, but that might be a concern too. Whether it will be Afghanistan, where like the Taliban are facing so much difficulties in just like doing the daily work of ruling a country. Whether this will become once again a hotbed for extremist organization, I don't know. But I will say that you need to have at some point like a crisis or somewhere where that will be like a sort of a pull effect. And then in Europe, of course, because that's something that we cannot totally overlook, is what will be the future of these activists. You've mentioned that several of them will get out of prisons. What will be their future? Maybe some of them will, just like end up not getting involved again in the movement, but probably so many of them will still, like in a way or another, be supportive of these ideas. So
there's kind of a real caliphate has never been tried kind of thing, like what happens with the communist utopia, right? Like people could be disillusioned with the ISIS project, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their ideology has gone anywhere.
And that's why it's super important to understand the utopian dimension of jihadism, and like every utopia in the world, every attempt that failed for someone who is convinced about the utopia is not about the project that is wrong or the utopia that is not accessible. Is about the group that enforced it poorly. And this is, was so interesting, because discussing with some of them in prisons, they were saying, like basically ISIS was just the wrong vehicle on the right road, which is the road of jihad and the road of the caliphate. So this is not over in that sense. You can destroy an organization without destroying an ideology. You can, of course, have an ideology that is developing even more so, even when the organization that praise it are on the downside. So I'll be cautious here. It's very difficult to project anything, to make any projection. What I think is that there was a sort of a wake-up call with ISIS. It was so violent and the terror campaign was so massive that it started to have like some permanent reflections about the phenomenon. And if you look at what happened, for instance, in the UK, once again, of course, there is some difficulties here and there, and the situation is not great on certain aspects, but you also have something that is quite interesting in the UK, which is you've got so much reform Islamists. Like, so you've got several, and this is something that is way more important in the UK, for instance, than in France or in Germany or in Belgium. Is like you have persons who were formerly involved in terrorist groups or in Islamist organizations who are now sort of defending and actively working on the ground against the spread of these ideas, and quite effectively, actually. So of course, we're only at year 7 of the wake-up call. After the wake-up call, the way is still very, very long. It's a long way to go, but I'm pretty sure that European democracies faced challenges that were bigger than this one in the past. They practically placed everything in their common history. So collectively, they might, be still stuff to develop, but it might be already like triggered and might be already on the way. Actually, I'm no one to pronounce myself in one way or another, but that's the stakes that are the elements that I wanted to bring to the table, at least.
Relatively, with a few caveats, relatively optimistic notes to end on, but definitely, I think you're right. Without caving to alarmism, I don't think this is over, and I think we could, like you said, avoid that alarmism by taking stock of things now and actually doing that recent historical work that isn't really being done. I don't think, at least in the UK. I think it's been happening to an extent in France and Belgium. massive thank you, and to everyone who tuned in. I think we've been, I think a few people have dropped off just because we've let this go on. It was a conversation I was really looking forward to, and I hope it's delivered. What can we expect next? When's stuff coming out in English? What are you doing next before you go?
Well, so first, the book is being published in January 2023. So the English version of my work. I'm publishing in French next week a small publication that will be out in the French public debate. And there is another book on the history of European jihadism on its way that will be published both in French and English as well.
Fantastic. Is there a way people can get a hold of you if they've got questions or anything like that?
Yeah, well, my mail at Princeton is online, and yeah, I'll try to respond as much as I can, but it's most of the time I'll do it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I know you're a very busy man with lots of writing and lots of other things in the works as well. And people are coming through saying thank you, they enjoyed it. So that's always good news. And
it was my pleasure, honestly. Thank you so much for your welcome, and it was a pleasure discussing with you. Always.
Thanks so much. Cheers. I'll leave you to get on with your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Take good care. Bye.